Welcome in, everybody. Ready to dive deep. Today, we're tackling something that might sound familiar, but we're going way beyond the surface level, the Green Revolution. Specifically, how it all went down in India.
It's a story with layers, you know, from those initial goals of just boosting how much food they could grow to the long-term effects, some we're still dealing with today.
Right, and the sources we've got for you, they really open your eyes. We're working with excerpts from this analysis. It's called Rockefeller's Agriculture and Integration of Indian Supply Chains. And let me tell you, it gets into some fascinating connections, details you wouldn't expect that really make you question the usual story about this whole period.
What really gets me is how you had all these different players, each with their own agendas, their own ways of doing things, all converging on India right at this crucial time. You've got philanthropic organizations like the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, government agencies like, well, the one before USA, the U.S. Technical Cooperation Administration, and then, of course, the Indian government themselves trying to figure it all out.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's the 1950s, India's freshly independent, and they're facing this huge problem: how to feed their ever-growing population. I mean, food security, that's got to be priority number one.
Absolutely. And right into this situation walks the Rockefeller Foundation, already a big name in international development. They come in pushing this science-based approach to agriculture, really focused on building up research places and getting everyone on board with modern technology.
Makes sense, right? Modernize how you farm, get more yields, problem solved. But I bet it wasn't that straightforward.
You bet it wasn't. See, India at this point, they were really into this community development model. It was all about local initiatives, letting each village community manage their own resources, their own development, really grassroots from the ground up.
So we've got a clash right from the get-go. Two totally different philosophies about how to develop.
You got it. Prime Minister Nehru, he was a big believer in community development,
Yeah.
saw it as how they'd build a more equal nation, one that could rely on itself, very much in line with what post-colonial India wanted to be.
But the Rockefeller Foundation, with their whole emphasis on science and infrastructure, they weren't exactly seeing eye to eye with this approach.
Well, they were laser focused on building that scientific base for progress in agriculture, investing in research institutions, coming up with new crop varieties, pushing things like fertilizers and pesticides. They saw that as the key to more food.
So it's not just how they wanted to do it, it's what they thought was important. India's looking at empowerment, and Rockefeller's all about top-down tech solutions.
And just to spice things up, you've got other groups coming in, each with their own goals. The Ford Foundation, for example, they were more about training people, building up the workforce for agriculture.
What about that U.S. Technical Cooperation Administration? What were they up to?
Oh, they were all about rural infrastructure, big on things like irrigation systems, roads. They thought that was essential for modernizing agriculture.
Wow, so you've got all these different groups, all these ideas and goals, all landing in India at this critical point. It seems like that'd make things pretty complicated.
It was a dynamic situation, that's for sure. And it's important to get these different perspectives, these agendas, because they really did shape how the Green Revolution played out in India.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of everyone wanting to develop things but not agreeing on how, and then boom, the Green Revolution itself kicks in. Where does that fit into this already messy picture?
Well, the Green Revolution, as we know, it really took off in India after '67. That's when they brought in these new types of wheat, the high-yielding kind, developed over in Mexico.
And those Mexican wheat varieties, those were a big deal, right? Like way more food being produced.
Huge deal. They were bred to love fertilizer and irrigation, which meant if you had good irrigation, your yields were skyrocketing compared to the old varieties.
So the Green Revolution's picking up steam, but it sounds like the foundation for it, all that groundwork, that's from those earlier efforts, especially what the Rockefeller Foundation was pushing with the whole science infrastructure thing.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. All that investment they made in agricultural research, in training people in India, even though there was pushback at first, it was crucial for the Green Revolution to even work.
So at first glance, it's a success story. More yields, more food, but something tells me there's more to this than we're seeing right now.
There always is, right? Remember, this is a lot of things tangled up together. Science, politics, money, how society works. And as this Green Revolution gets going, it starts having consequences they didn't expect. Some good, some not so good.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. But before we get into those consequences, there's one more piece we got to bring in, something that really changes how we understand what was driving all this.
And this is where it gets a little bit wild. We're talking about a document kept secret for years. A classified report, they called it National Security Study Memorandum 200, NSSM 200 for short.
Sounds like something out of a spy movie. What's the big deal with this document?
Okay, picture this. It's 1974, Cold War's in full swing. President Nixon, he wants a study done on how fast the world population is growing, what it means for the U.S. for their security.
And that study, that's this NSSM 200.
Exactly. And what makes it so important is that it basically says, hey, we can use food policy and population control to get what we want around the world.
Hold on, they're talking about controlling how many people there are in other countries so the U.S. benefits.
That's the gist of it. And they specifically point to developing countries, the ones with lots of resources.
And that's where India comes back in, right?
I know it. India, huge population, tons of resources. They were a main target for this strategy.
All right, this NSSM 200 thing, it's raising a lot of questions. What exactly were they planning to do? And how does it tie into the Green Revolution? We'll dig into that and more when we come back for part 2 of this deep dive.
All right, so we're back, diving deeper into this Green Revolution story. And last we left off, things were getting kind of intense with that whole classified document, the NSSM 200, and what it meant for India. Population control as a U.S. foreign policy tool, it really makes you think.
It definitely challenges the idea that aid is always just about helping others. This NSSM 200, it just comes right out and says it, population growth in these developing countries, it's a threat to the U.S. getting the resources and markets they need.
So what were they actually going to do about it? I mean, this wasn't just about handing out flyers about family planning.
Oh, no, it was way more involved than that. This NSSM 200, it was all about a multi-pronged approach, as they called it. More money for population control programs, giving people access to contraception, even promoting sterilization.
Sterilization, that seems, I don't know, a bit extreme. It was, and still is, a huge point of controversy. The document even talks about, get this, using food aid as a way to push countries to adopt population control measures. Like, hey, we'll give you food, but only if you agree to limit your population.
Wow, so basically using food as a bargaining chip to get their way.
You could definitely see it that way. The idea was no population control policies, no aid. Pretty heavy stuff.
It is, and it's hard not to connect this back to the Green Revolution, especially when you look at who was actually involved in putting this NSSM 200 together.
That's the key, isn't it? Remember, we talked about John D. Rockefeller III, how he was a driving force behind this whole study. Well, there was another big name involved, William Pierce. He was a top guy at Cargill, one of the biggest agricultural corporations in the world.
Cargill, right. So we're talking about a straight-up link between U.S. agribusiness and this population control strategy.
It's a pretty big link, and it shows you how much money and politics were mixed up in all of this. I mean, think about it. Agribusiness wins big if they can get into new markets and sell their stuff.
And if the population keeps growing in places like India, they're going to need more food from somewhere, right? That's where companies like Cargill step in.
Exactly. NSSM 200, it even talks about how important it is to boost agricultural exports.
Yeah.
It's all tied together. Population growth, U.S. economic interests, it's all part of the plan.
Okay, so we've got this, I gotta say, kind of disturbing idea of population control being used as a tool, and then the Green Revolution, which on the surface is all about producing more food. It seems to be playing right into this whole agenda.
It's important to remember that the Green Revolution, it had a lot of different effects, good and bad. On the one hand, it did lead to a huge increase in food production, especially in those parts of India that had good irrigation.
Yeah, and for a country struggling to feed everyone, that's a big win. But we also touched on some of the downsides, right? Back in part 1, I mean. What were some of the not-so-great things that came out of this approach?
Well, one of the main things was that the Green Revolution, it was very much a top-down kind of thing, all about technology and these massive farms. And often, it was the small farmers, the ones using traditional ways of farming, who got left behind.
So not exactly what India had in mind with that whole community development idea?
Nope, not really. See, to be part of this Green Revolution, you had to do things a certain way. You needed the hybrid seeds, the chemical fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation.
Yeah.
The whole package.
And all that stuff, it wasn't exactly cheap, was it?
Not even close. A lot of those small farmers, they were already barely getting by. They had to take out loans just to buy all this stuff, which put them in a really tough spot.
And those hybrid seeds, they were a one-time thing, right?
Actually, no. That's the kicker. You couldn't just save seeds from your harvest and plant them the next year. Nope. Got to buy new ones every year. Can you imagine the pressure on these farmers, especially the small ones, who are already struggling to make ends meet? It's like They were trapped in a system where they had to keep buying from these big U.S. companies.
Right. And the environmental effects, all those chemicals, the fertilizers and pesticides, it was bad news for the soil, for the water, even for all the different plants and animals that live there.
So, yeah, they got more food, but at what cost? I mean, think about how much water they were using for all that irrigation and the chemicals. It wasn't just about debt. It was about poisoning the land itself. Our sources, they talk about how over time the yield started going down, so then they needed even more chemicals just to keep up. It's a vicious cycle. It really shows you how focusing on what works in the short term, it can sometimes backfire in the long run. The Green Revolution, yeah, it helped them produce more food at first, but it kind of ignored whether those farming practices were sustainable, whether they were good for the small farmers in the long haul.
And this whole shift to industrialized agriculture, it changed society too, right? All those small farmers, they couldn't keep up with this new system, so a lot of them lost their land.
Exactly. They ended up going to the cities looking for work. And that just led to more problems, more people living in slums, more social unrest.
So the Green Revolution, it seemed like a simple solution to the food problem, but it really created a whole bunch of new challenges.
And it's not like those challenges just disappeared.
Hmm.
They're still affecting things today. How agriculture works, environmental policies, how society is structured. All of that, in India and around the world, it's still being shaped by what happened back then.
And this is all before we even get to GMOs, genetically modified organisms, which takes everything we've talked about to a whole other level. But that, my friends, is a story for part 3 of our deep dive. Stick with us.
All right, we're back for the final part of our Green Revolution deep dive. And as promised, we're going to tackle how this whole era set the scene for, well, GMOs, genetically modified organisms. Feels like the next chapter after everything we've talked about.
It really is. The Green Revolution, it really got the ball rolling for this idea of tech-driven agriculture, where corporations, they start calling more of the shots. Think of it like this. The Green Revolution was all about finding those good traits in plants through crossbreeding. But GMOs, they take it a step further. They go right into the plant's DNA, change it up in a lab.
But weren't GMOs supposed to, get rid of all those chemicals, less spraying and all that? That doesn't really sound like something corporations would be pushing for. Did our sources say anything about that? Yeah, that was definitely part of the sales pitch. The whole idea was to create crops that could handle pests and herbicides, so you wouldn't have to spray so much. But it hasn't really worked out that way. In fact, bringing in GMOs has actually led to more herbicide use, especially this stuff called glyphosate. It's the main ingredient in Roundup, that weed killer from Monsanto.
So less chemicals was the goal, but we ended up with more. How'd that happen?
Well, for one thing, they created these crops that could handle being sprayed with glyphosate. So farmers could just drench their fields with the stuff, kill all the weeds, and the GMO crop would be fine. But that meant everyone was using a ton of glyphosate.
Yeah.
And then people started getting worried, about whether it was bad for the environment, bad for people's health.
And what about the whole corporate control thing?
GMOs, they gave companies like Monsanto even more power over the seeds. They patented these genetically engineered seeds, so it became illegal for farmers to do what they'd always done: save seeds from their harvest and plant them the next year. Nope, you got to buy new seeds from Monsanto every single year. It's like they trapped farmers in this system where they were totally dependent on them.
So the Green Revolution had already tilted the scales towards these big corporations, and then GMOs came along and just made it even worse.
That's one way to put it. The Green Revolution, it kind of made industrialized agriculture the norm, made everyone think they needed all these external inputs. So when GMOs came along, it was like, oh, well, this is just the next logical step. Easy to convince people.
And those networks we talked about, the foundations, the government agencies, the corporations all working together, they were still pushing GMOs all over the world, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Rockefeller Foundation, they kept funding research on GMOs. They saw it as a solution to food shortages, which, in a way, it could be. And USAID, they are out there promoting GMOs in developing countries, often as part of their aid programs. It's all connected.
So it's not just a coincidence that GMOs popped up after the Green Revolution. It's like the same story, just the next chapter. Still pushing technology as the answer, corporations getting more powerful, and aid being used as a way to get what they want on the world stage.
And, the GMO debate, it's still raging. Some people say we need GMOs to feed everyone, especially with climate change and all that. But others, they're worried about the risks, about corporations having so much control over our food.
It's a tough one, that's for sure. But what's clear is that the Green Revolution, it was a turning point. It kicked off this whole era of industrial agriculture with all the good and bad that came with it. And the debates we're having now about food, about technology, about power, they all go back to what happened then. So after looking at all this, what's your main takeaway?
I think the big thing to remember is that technology, it's never just neutral. It's always influenced by what's happening in the world at that time.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about something as important as food, we got to be really careful about the choices we make. Think about the good stuff, sure, but also about the long-term consequences, even the ones we don't see coming.
Yeah, it's a warning, but also a chance to do better. We got to get involved, ask the tough questions, think about different ways of doing things. Our food system, it's complicated, but it affects all of us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Maybe this whole green revolution thing with all its twists and turns, maybe it can teach us something. It can remind us to be critical, to really understand the big picture when we're talking about technology and how it's going to solve the world. When you hear about India's green revolution, you probably think success, like a total game changer. It seemed like India was well on its way to being totally self-sufficient with food.
Mm-hmm.
But today, we're diving deep into a bunch of articles about the economic shifts in Indian agriculture since then.
Okay, yeah.
And, well, it turns out it's not as simple as just progress.
Yeah, you're right. The Green Revolution did boost production, like, a lot, for certain crops at least, and in some areas more than others. But the long-term economic effects, they've created a tangled web of, well, pressures and challenges for India's agricultural policies, especially as the country's become more integrated into the global economy.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to focus on the higher yields.
Yeah.
That's the headline. But our mission today is to go deeper, to really see how things like international agreements, all those economic forces at play, and the big push for global supply chains,
Yeah.
especially with the U.S., how these have reshaped Indian agriculture, like
Yeah.
fundamentally. We've got some sources here that touch on early involvement from groups like the Rockefeller Foundation.
Uh-huh.
Though we don't have all the details from these excerpts,
Uh-huh.
but we can see how Indian policy has evolved with these global economic forces. So let's unpack this idea that maybe the rapid growth didn't just keep going.
Right. So what's interesting is what the data says about the period after the Green Revolution. Kind of counterintuitive, really. The articles show that the average growth rate for agricultural production, well, it actually slowed down compared to before the revolution. So, big takeaway number one, the Green Revolution's success wasn't just this straight upward climb. It challenges how we usually think about it.
That's really important. It does make you rethink the typical story. And even more telling, I think, is that per capita agricultural output. So that's the output per person working in agriculture. In many parts of India, it just stalled or even went down.
Right. Yeah.
So even if the total food production went up, an individual farmer in many regions, they didn't see their own output increase.
Right. And you have to tie this to the bigger economic shifts that were happening at the same time. The Green Revolution wasn't just about Indians growing more food. It also it created this huge market for agribusiness firms.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, from the U.S. and other countries. Suddenly, there was this big demand for chemical fertilizers, pesticides, all petroleum-based, and modern farm machinery. It was the boom of what we now call agribusiness.
So it wasn't just Indian farmers. It was a big commercial opening for international companies. Okay, so let's move forward a bit. How did those international agreements and financial crises that hit India, how do they change the agricultural landscape?
Well, that's where you really see domestic needs bumping up against global pressures. The articles show a progression from things like agrofinance, which was about supporting the agricultural sector, to the arrival of, you could call it the American Consensus. And that came through agreements like GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and then the WTO, the World Trade Organization, specifically their agreement on agriculture policies. And this American Consensus, it's basically a set of neoliberal economic policies that the U.S. really pushed for. And the goal, freer trade, mainly, and importantly, more access for American imports into developing economies.
Right, so global trade rules were now having a big say in India's agricultural policies. And then there was the 1991 foreign exchange crisis. That feels like a pivotal moment.
It was. In 1991, India had a major foreign currency shortage.
Uh,
So they made an agreement with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, but it came with very specific conditions. The articles detail how the IMF wanted India to remove government subsidies, dismantle the public distribution system, The PDS, that's the system that distributes food to people at subsidized prices.
Right, right.
And the IMF wanted India to open its market to more competition from, well, American and Western companies. It was a fundamental move towards a market-driven economy.
It's amazing how directly these IMF conditions went after the core of India's agricultural support system. And wasn't the World Bank pretty influential, too, in shaping policy back then?
Yeah. The articles mention the World Bank's India Country Economic Memorandum, especially Volume 2. It paints a pretty stark picture of India's economic situation at the time. The country's credit rating had dropped so much that getting international loans was basically impossible.
Oh, wow.
And the World Bank, they basically said, look, India, you don't have many options. Structural adjustment is a must.
So structural adjustment is...
It's a whole set of policy changes to make the economy more market-oriented. It was the price for getting more financial help.
Okay, so Volume I of that World Bank memo, it had some very specific recommendations, right, for how to, well, essentially remake Indian agriculture.
Yeah. The core recommendations were pretty radical. They wanted India to slash, or at least drastically cut, almost all agricultural subsidies. Subsidies for fertilizer, water, even the electricity used for irrigation, agricultural loans, almost everything. And open the agricultural sector completely to foreign trade. They even pushed to dismantle the whole system of public procurement of food grains and the public distribution system itself.
So they wanted to get rid of, or at least seriously change, the very systems meant to help Indian farmers and make sure people had enough to eat. And didn't Indian governments, even though they face opposition, try to follow these guidelines?
Yeah, that's important to understand. Governments in India have often faced huge public resistance and political pushback against these reforms.
I can imagine.
So implementing them has been slow. And sometimes parts of the reforms were rolled back or changed. But the overall direction, it's been towards liberalization, mainly because of these international financial pressures and the conditions tied to loans and trade agreements.
Okay, let's talk more about the public distribution system, the PDS. It sounds like the changes to make it more targeted actually backfired.
It's kind of ironic, actually. The targeted public distribution system started in 1997. The idea was to make it more efficient, but it actually made the whole PDS weaker. By dividing consumers into groups like those above poverty line, it excluded or discouraged a lot of people who were still struggling financially. So demand within the PDS went down. And what happened, they ended up with a surplus of grain, and then they used those surpluses to argue for cutting back the PDS even more, or getting rid of it altogether.
Oh, wow. So the changes made to improve the PDS were used as a reason to dismantle it, as kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
And the articles also talk about worries about mass displacement of people who depend on agriculture.
Yeah. So connecting this move towards a more market-driven agricultural system to people's livelihoods, you see this 1996 World Bank estimate. They said maybe 400 million Indians would need to leave agriculture and go to urban areas to work in industry and manufacturing. It's a staggering number.
Yeah.
And this was seen as, just part of modernizing the economy.
And it wasn't just international groups pushing for a shift away from agriculture. The articles mention that even in India, during Raghuram Rajan's time as chief economic advisor and under the UPA government, there was this idea of making agriculture less attractive to boost services and manufacturing.
Right. The policy focus and even investment, it moved away from actively supporting agriculture. And unfortunately, this has probably added to the problems Indian agriculture is facing today, like farmers being deep in debt and the need for farm loan waivers, which are basically a political tool to deal with the economic distress in the sector.
It really shows how long-term policy changes can have big social and economic consequences way down the line. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of WTO pressures on India's agricultural subsidies.
The heart of the WTO pressure is this fundamental disagreement. Developed countries and developing countries like India, they don't see eye to eye on the role of government in agriculture, especially when it comes to subsidies and holding public stocks of food grains. Developed countries, often through the Cairns Group.
The Cairns Group.
Right. It's a group of 19 agricultural exporting countries. They generally believe farmers should operate based on market prices set by private companies.
Yeah.
So less government involvement and support.
Okay. And the Cairns Group, they've been really critical of India's minimum support price, haven't they?
Yeah.
The MSP.
Definitely. They argue that India's public stockholding program, where the government buys grains from farmers at the MSP, it involves huge subsidies. And they say these subsidies mess with global food prices and hurt food security and export opportunities for other countries. Trade experts, like Abhijit Das, they think the Cairns Group's real goal is to change or shrink India's MSP scheme.
So the Indian government sees MSP as a way to support its farmers and ensure food security, but it's facing all this international pressure to cut back because of WTO rules. What about the peace clause? We hear about that a lot.
Right. The peace clause was agreed on in 2013 in Bali. It basically protects India from legal challenges at the WTO, even if their agricultural subsidies go above the allowed limits. But the thing is, the articles point out that the peace clause is kind of vague. It has conditions, so India could still face disputes. And more importantly, any new laws or any expansion of the MSP program beyond what's already happening, they probably wouldn't be covered by the peace clause. So that increases the risk of WTO challenges.
So the Indian government is in a tough spot. They have to balance the needs of their farmers with their commitments under international trade agreements. And it's interesting to compare the per-farmer subsidies in India with countries like the U.S. It's a big difference, right?
Huge. When you calculate the total agricultural subsidy according to WTO rules, India's might be over the limit.
Okay.
But that's because of the sheer size of the agricultural sector and the population. The amount given to each farmer in India is way lower than in developed countries. It's something like, what, $300 per farmer in India on average, compared to, say, $40,000 per farmer in the U.S. But the WTO rules, they mainly look at the total value of subsidies, not how much each farmer gets.
So even though individual Indian farmers get relatively little support, the overall size of the sector means those subsidies are scrutinized. And India has been trying to work on these issues within the WTO, hasn't it? Especially with that ministerial summit in Abu Dhabi coming up.
They have. India wants a permanent solution. They want to change the formula for calculating the limit on food subsidies. And they want to extend the peace clause to cover programs that started after 2013. But the article suggests that getting everyone to agree on such sensitive issues, given how differently developed and developing countries see things, it's going to be tough. They might hit a deadlock.
Okay, so it sounds like agricultural subsidies and the WTO, they're going to be a big issue for a while. Let's shift gears to the present. What about the trade pressures India is facing now from the U.S.? The articles seem to suggest that these demands are linked to those policy changes we talked about earlier.
Yeah. What's striking is how the pressures that started with the economic reforms back in the 90s after 1991, they're still shaping things today. The articles point out that the Trump administration, and by extension, U.S. multinational corporations, especially those in agriculture, they've used the threat of trade tariffs to pressure India. They want India to lower or remove tariffs on U.S. agricultural products. This echoes what the articles call the unstated aim of NSSM 200. That's National Security Study Memorandum 200, though we don't have the specifics from these excerpts. But it implies a long-term U.S. strategy to get a bigger share of India's huge agricultural market.
So wanting to open up the Indian market for American products isn't new. It's part of a bigger, longer-term plan. And the Indian government has pushed back a bit, right, to protect their own agricultural sector.
Yeah. India's been careful about the potential impact of more American imports. They're worried about domestic production. And also about their own exports, especially to markets in Africa, the Middle East, other parts of the global south. And the articles point out that this push for greater market access isn't just about agriculture. It's about other important sectors, too. Media, space, defense, telecommunications, even healthcare and food standards. American companies have been trying to get more influence there, too.
It sounds like a pretty broad strategy to integrate India more deeply into the U.S. economic sphere in all these critical areas. And the articles even talk about the growing defense cooperation between the U.S. and India as another part of this.
Right. The official line from White House statements is that they want to integrate Indian industry more into the global supply chains of those big U.S. defense and aerospace companies.
Okay.
And we see it in technology, too, especially IT. And there are those collaborations in space exploration and satellite communication, companies like SpaceX, India's ISRO, and in the telecom sector with things like Starlink.
And while this cooperation in technology and defense could have benefits, the articles say that India needs to protect its own key sectors, especially with things like AI developing so fast, artificial intelligence.
That's so important. It's great to embrace new technologies and work with other countries, but India has to be smart about protecting its own strategic interests in things like space, defense, its telecommunications infrastructure, and especially data security and governance. especially with AI changing the landscape so quickly.
So it's not just about industries. This deeper integration is about fitting into global economic norms, with India playing by the rules of international banking and finance, and keeping the U.S. dollar as a major reserve currency.
Exactly. This interconnectedness makes it harder for India to move away from the US-led global economic system.
Mm.
And the current US administration, they seem to want to push this integration even further. They're targeting agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and automobiles. They want to remove trade barriers. And the article suggests that this could turn India into a trade territory for American interests.
The American Secretary of Commerce has been pretty vocal about this, hasn't he?
He has. He wants lower trade barriers so American companies can compete more freely in India. The articles end with a warning. They say to watch out for what they call the hegemonic dreams of the American empire.
Which brings up a big question. How do you balance the good things about global economic engagement with protecting national sovereignty and economic independence? In a world that's so interconnected and competitive, it's the tension between the opportunities of global trade and the need to protect domestic industries and safeguard those long-term strategic interests. So, to wrap up our deep dive, we've seen how the Green Revolution, while it did increase production initially, also paved the way for more involvement with global agribusiness. The economic reforms in 1991, driven by a financial crisis and influenced by international institutions, they pushed for big changes in agricultural policy. Things like reducing subsidies and opening up the market. These changes have had a lasting impact on the public distribution system, and they've raised concerns about people potentially being displaced from agriculture. India is still dealing with pressures from the WTO about its agricultural subsidies and MSP. And now, there's this renewed pressure from the U.S. to lower trade barriers even more in key sectors.
And for you, our listeners, understanding this complex history and the economic context, it's crucial if you want to really get the nuances of the debates happening about Indian agriculture right now. And India's place in the global economy, these aren't just isolated policy decisions. They're all connected. They're part of this bigger story of how India's developing and engaging with the rest of the world.
It really makes you think about the future. India needs to grow economically, but it's also committed to supporting its huge agricultural population. So how do they navigate these global pressures in a way that's sustainable? How do they balance food security for their people and protect the livelihoods of their farmers while still engaging with the global economy in a way that benefits India in the long run? That's a question worth pondering, even after our deep dive today.
Definitely. It's something to think about.